Hello and welcome back to an episode of the CTO Show with Mehmet. Today, I'm very pleased. Joining me from Colorado in the US, Dr. Steve Rondeau. Dr. Steve, of course, he's coming from a medical background, but also he's done a lot of work studying the human brain. He published papers, books, and today we're going to talk about this important topic. But I don't like to steal much from my guests' time, as the audience know by now. I keep it to themselves to introduce themselves. So, Dr. Steve, again, thank you very much for being here with me today. Let us know a little more about you, your background, your journey, and what you're currently up to, and then we can start right away the discussion from there.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mehmet. Yeah, so I have a long journey that sort of got me to where I'm at, but I think ultimately, where we're at now is trying to answer the question of how two people with the same diagnosis, mental health diagnosis, can respond so differently to treatment. And I think everything I did up until this point has got me to a place where that's our obsession right now is how do we answer that question? So rewind back about 20 some years or so. I was working mostly in autism and developmental pediatrics. I just finished medical school, did my residency training, and worked almost exclusively in pediatrics and developmental disorders, like I was saying. And one thing that really um, was profoundly obvious to me was how objective data can guide treatment so sort of intuitively in that field, just like every other field of medicine. But when we started our mental health practice in 2009 here in Colorado, it was a totally different story. And so, talking to the psychiatrist and the other mental health providers, it became apparent to me that it was a lot more clinical judgment, a lot more experience, a lot more uh, intuition and feeling than it was based on testing. And I think when I came to that place, my brain didn't know how to handle that. It's like, how do we do this without data? And so that's the question we've been trying to answer now for about the last 20 years.
So, this is what you usually you define it, or like you describe it as the guessing game, I believe, right? So, what is broken, Steve? Like, why, people they didn't think about it for a long time, in your opinion?
Yeah, you mean in terms of the system and how it works?
Yes.
Yeah. It's there's an illusion of objectivity, I think, that's come in the field over the years. And maybe I'll answer that question with a question for you, which is, when you have, I mean, how many people do you know that say have depression, but when you meet them, look very different? Or you could substitute, if you don't know depression, anxiety or ADHD, and how different they look individually. So, I mean, I'm sort of asking you that question. Can you think of two people like that and how different they may seem in
We
their life?
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, I can think. I'm not an expert, but
Mhm.
sometimes I think I saw also people who denies like
Ah,
have having something, but I think they need to go and not because it's a sickness. Of course,
right.
everyone knows like it's something for our well-being. So I think they need to go and check themselves. But yeah, I know also people who think that they have something, but yeah, and maybe you can enlighten us more, Steve, about it. Like, and I think the way of living that we have today, especially with this fast-paced
Oh,
technology changes, is one of the main factor. Um,
undoubtedly.
so just I know you're gonna answer and put that, but also I want to try to understand from you within the same topic as a clinician, like how, like what kept repeating in patient care that made you start looking for objective biological measurements instead of symptom based diagnosis? Because if you go today, people they get out a set of questions, fixated questions I call them, and then they say, okay, based on this you answered that. So what patterns you saw, like you also, I would say, uh, like it encouraged you to know that there is another way of doing these.
Yeah, yeah, those are good questions. I mean, coming back to where we're at, I think what I've seen in my years of doing this and working with many, many mental health providers is that we've relied a lot on a diagnostic system that um, does a very, very good job at describing people's suffering. Okay. We have a manual that describes it very well. Um, Largely, it's done with the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's been through a number of revisions, in which new one is on the horizon. But it doesn't give us a full picture of what's going to actually help that person. And I think that's what's uniquely different about mental health versus the other specialties in medicine. Whereas you have this illusion that the diagnosis is going to get us to an answer, it actually doesn't. And that's been published in a number of studies, that the correlation between an accurate diagnosis and treatment outcome is actually, or positive treatment outcome is actually quite low. And so it speaks to this underlying sort of physiology that makes us all unique. And so, your flavor of anxiety and my flavor may look totally different if we both, had the same, hypothetical diagnosis here. And so that's what we're trying to understand. And so the book that we use for diagnosing does a very good job of describing how we um, may may converse, how me and you may talk about a condition, about a patient, a shared patient, but it doesn't help us understand how we got to that point. And so when you start to answer that question, you start to see the variability within individuals, and why perhaps that can explain how people respond so differently to all these interventions. We have, say for ADHD, for example, we have medications that speed our brain up, we have medications that slow our brain down, and everything sort of in between. And so it really speaks to the variability. But if you have a 8-year-old child in front of you who's diagnosed with ADHD or struggling in school, you want to know which thing is going to help them, as opposed to just trying a bunch of treatments and hoping one of them sticks. So,
Right.
yeah.
um and in order to have this better way of doing things, I know like you've built a database of more
Mhm.
than 50,000 brain scans.
Mhm.
um it's not an easy task to do, so I'm sure
Mhm.
like there were a lot of challenges in collecting the data. And then of course, so people thinks, yeah, collecting data is easy. What, it's simple. They just put the patient in the machine, and then they take the scan and that's it. But of course there are like a lot of missing parts, I would say, of course, without going too much technical maybe. But like, how is that process, and what are like the most difficult part about it, especially because you have to standardize the data, and of course there is the other, I would say, challenges around how to correlate this data together after 50,000 scans.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm sort of having flashbacks to about 2016 or so, when we started the project, and the idea at that point was to gather all the brain scans that we had done that time, hundreds, and compile them into a repository where we could just have them. So, say I want to come out and do a presentation to your group about, whatever, stress or ADHD or something. And so I would have a repository of brains where I could go and look up pictures and cases and, do interesting work with it. Said, hey, we have so much data, let's do something interesting with it. At that point, I was doing much more clinical work. And so these scans were all used by me clinically and our team of individuals here. And so I go to my tech team, and they're building this essentially sort of primitive file cabinet for me. Okay, this sort of basic project, a few $1,000s. And they said, "Hey, we can add, AI tools to this, and really take this to the next level if you'd like." And my ears sort of perked up, and I was like, "Well, that sounds interesting. I like tech and I like data. Let's see if we can pull these things together." And so what turned into probably a 2 or 3 month project has now evolved into a, seemingly never-ending project now. And we are constantly refining and constantly making it better. But the idea was is to take those scans and to be able to make some meaningful conclusions and so forth from it. And now it's evolved into a much more elaborate process of looking well beyond what we could ever see with our sort of naive human eye. And so when we gather EEG data, which is actually quite easy to do, I think a lot of times when we talk about brain scans, people picture a tube and sedation, and we're going to sit in a scary thing with a lead vest or something. It's quite easy. In fact, you could do brain scans in just about any kind of context, even functionally with an athlete or something, for example. Okay, so it's very
Hmm.
very easy and sort of practical to do these days, especially with the hardware evolving. So we record these data, and then we have it processed through our system. So in doing that, we've piqued the interest of a lot of other groups, and so they started sending us data, and we started processing their data. Said, "Hey, can you process ours? Can you process ours?" And we started getting data from all over the place, from law enforcement to first responders to groups in Hollywood with peak performers and actors and everything in between. So we have all these little niche groups of people where we can process their data and help them understand their brain better and help them perform better. So um, I think to answer your question specifically around the challenges, I mean, I think the challenges are limited by, what do we do with all the data that we have? How do we process it into meaningful, ways and make it understandable? And how do we bring something to the masses that don't quite understand, what it is we do or don't know that they need it yet? And I think for me, that's one of the bigger challenges is changing um, essentially sort of a dinosaur and getting that to change from where we are now with, subjective questionnaires to making this routine before we do any intervention to understand, hey, what's going on with this person? So, for example, I mean, I ultimately want to answer the question of like, someone comes in and they say, I'm depressed. Well, is it a biological hardwiring pattern that we can measure? Okay.
Hmm.
Or is it circumstantial based on, trauma, grief, something that happened to you? Or is it both? And likely there's a middle ground that includes both. But if you include the biological data, that the range of possibilities is enormous. So we did a presentation for providers the other day, and I had one of my middle school kids do the math for me because this was a complicated math problem. I said, "Hey, son, come here." This was my advanced math seventh grader. I said, "I have 12 different brain patterns we measure." Might not sound like a lot. We actually measure thousands, but we report on a dozen different patterns. Okay. And I said, if we have these 12 patterns and any one of these can show up like depression, and again, this was a presentation to providers about depression, I said, what's the possible combinations of patterns that you could have in one individual? And so there's over 4,096 different combinations of patterns that you can have in that brain scan. So if someone comes in with depression, okay, and you're a provider without objective data, okay, we just have a questionnaire and symptoms. There's over 4,000 different combinations, okay?
Wow.
So now your job as a provider is to and I use the word guess nicely, I mean, but it's an educated guess, to guess which treatment is going to work for that patient. Okay. Now, if you really want your mind blown, we're adding a new biomarker to our panel here this week. Now you've taken 4,000 and you've doubled it. It's going to be over 8,000 combinations of patterns that could show up, all of which respond differently to different treatments. And imagine the trial and error for that patient. But not only that, imagine the exhaustion on the provider's behalf of having to help those people, because we all go into it for the same reason. We all go in to help people. But if you're trying, I mean, 1 in 8,000, that's like playing the lottery, you know? That's tough.
Yeah.
That's very
Yeah.
tough, and it wears on you after a while, you know?
Right. Now, when you started to, of course, as you said, to your point, like, of course, collecting the data is the first challenge, and then, what to do with this data. But once you started it to do the analysis, um, can you tell us, for example, about one example where maybe for years, conventional psychiatric thinking was telling something, while your data proved the opposite. And of
Mm,
course, the data, like when you see a lot of patterns, like, oh my God, like we might say, okay, we knew all this information wrong all these years. We hold on it. And yeah, here we go. Here's the scientific proof. And, because we did all this analysis. So was there anything similar, maybe, or maybe close to?
yeah, I know what you're saying. There's two things that come to mind. One of them has to do with suicidality, which um, I think, you know, they're probably in the bigger scheme of life, and this probably isn't the topic of the podcast, but I don't think there are coincidences in that way. I think this was sort of given to me to figure out. So I think the suicidality part is one, and the other was a case that we talk about in the book of a girl who, and maybe I'll start there, was in her 20s, and at
Hmm.
that time I was working in residential addiction substance use center with these kids 17 to 25, and they would come in after having been sober. And this was a transitional living arrangement that we have for these people to go back into life. And so we do brain scans on these individuals, on everyone that comes through the center. Okay. And a lot of times we don't have history, which is another sort of challenge within um, sort of disjointed care within the system, and which is getting better, but it still can be a challenge of getting information. These are people from all over the world, all over the country. So this girl comes in, and I said, I look at her brain and I said, why are you here? You don't look like a lot of the other people that we see at this center. So this looks quite different. This looks like you have like ADHD or maybe some learning issues. Like what's going on?
Hmm.
Says, "Well, I have panic attacks. I can't leave the house. I've been in 3 residential addiction centers, or 3 different residential centers. I'm finally in an addiction center. I don't have an addiction. I just am struggling, and they didn't know what else to do with me." So they have her in this center, and these are, I mean, you're not just hanging out here for fun. I mean, they're very expensive, and this is someone who's deeply struggling. So I said, "Well, why don't we treat you like you have ADHD? Because that's what your brain is telling me. That's what the pictures look like. Instead of treating you as if you have panic, because looking at your list here, you've been on 40 different medications. She's in her 20s, 40 different medications. So why don't we treat you as if you have ADHD?" So we go back to the psychiatrist and I tell him, he says, well, I mean, she's in an addiction, she's in a treatment center. We've got, safe, environment. Let's try it. And so we did. And within a couple of days, I mean, that was it. These short acting ADHD medications transformed her life. Panic attacks went away. And, the rest is history, happy ending kind of story. And, but the point of that is that if we had only treated her story and only treated her label, she would have continued down these paths of medications that were targeting the label, not what her brain was saying, not what her brain was saying. And so by treating what the brain was saying, we understood, her words were sort of the manifestation of those patterns. And so it was really a transformative moment for us. And I think once the psychiatric team saw that, it became sort of a light bulb moment of like, hey, we need to be doing this like routinely on people. And so actually that's one of the key moments that really springboarded this work to be done routinely on all of the mental health patients that came into that center, and then subsequently just grew from there. But once you see that, I mean, you just can't unsee how that is, but to the just to backpedal for a second, to put a woman like this on the treatment that we did based on her diagnosis would largely be considered like, borderline malpractice, because you would never do that to someone who's having a panic attack, right? Someone who's anxious, and you say,
Hmm.
"Hey, I'm going to give you like 3 Red Bulls or 12 cups of coffee." They would be like, "No way. Like that's crazy. You're going to make it
Right.
worse." But in reality, your brain was going too slow, not too fast. So I think one of the key learning, moments from that was understanding that, hey, there's there's anxious brains that are going too slow, and there's anxious brains that are going too fast, and we can't treat them the same. And so that was really the start of it, from there. And so, yeah, like I said, the suicide stuff too really transformed us a lot too, and understanding that people can largely be struggling um, with suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation, and we know even just from behavioral research that most of that goes unspoken. Most first
Right.
time suicide attempters don't tell anybody, and so if we can see that in the brain data, it can open up conversations. It can open up conversations with law enforcement officer or a pilot or a teacher or a guy who's suffering at home with a family, but you don't know it because he hasn't told anybody. And so having that data, it doesn't have to be a label, it doesn't have to be a sentence, it can just be a conversation starter to say, hey, I see these patterns that are associated with perfectionism and negative self-talk. Tell me about that. How does that show up in you? And then it starts the conversation. So that's been a lot of fun work for us in those two areas for sure.
Yeah, just one thing, which I'm curious to
Please.
understand more, because you mentioned about the biomarkers also as well. So yeah, got the brain scan part of it, and the example that you just gave is great one, for anyone to understand, how that works. But I'm curious about, again, I'm not the expert you are, Steve.
Mhm.
Um, how much you know the genetics, the DNA plays role, because we always hear sometimes, like, okay, um this boy is angry like his father, or like this
Right.
girl is like behaves certainly because her mother. Is this purely psychological and brain related, or like really is there something also in the DNA, or like maybe in our other part of the body that might be responsible for certain symptoms related to these kinds of mental health issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I get variations of that question quite a bit. And certainly we don't have all the answers. What we do have is a starting place to have a conversation about data, taking the subjectivity out. Okay. And that's what we want to try to do is to take that subjectivity out of the equation and, language barriers, cultural barriers, and these sorts of things, and just look at the data. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a neck down component, we call it, that plays a large role in how people experience the world and how their brains, respond to, say, stressors, for example. So as far as genes playing a role, I mean, absolutely, there's likely a component. But if it were genes alone, of course, we would probably have an answer for a lot of these complex behavioral and psychiatric types of conditions. And so, what we're trying to do is see how um, those measures, those sort of like static measures, show up functionally in a brain. Okay. And so I think that's the key, is to say, okay, yes, you have this gene. Okay. But is it being expressed in a biological way that can be manipulated or supported? And I think that's one of the main things that we're trying to do, but also understanding, and this is a big part of why we wrote the book, the Think Like a Brain book, just recently, is that we want people to understand that these labels aren't just um, deficits or problems, but they can be strengths and gifts when they're supported. And so once you see the patterns, you can start to create environments that support those patterns. So we started talking about this before the call, actually. About environments. I didn't know we'd get into this, but we were talking about Arizona, which I just left. And when we take our huskies, we have two huskies. Huskies, big furry dogs, two coats.
Yeah.
Okay. When we take them to Arizona, they're absolutely miserable. Okay. Those dogs are miserable. They don't want to go outside. They don't want to play. It's just not a good environment for huskies. Okay. But when we bring them back to Colorado and we take them up to the mountains and they're playing in the snow, those dogs are happy as can be. Now, if I were to evaluate those dogs in Arizona, they would be depressed. They may be moody, pick a label. Okay. But if I evaluate them playing in the snow with a pack, and I can't even get them to come inside. They're having so much fun. And so that's what we want to try to show with these brain scans too, is that people aren't broken. They're functioning with brain patterns that aren't being supported in their environment. And so I think that if we can start to create those environments, we can show where people are, where their gifts are. So back to your question about these other sort of physiological and biological components, is that um, having those static measures doesn't necessarily show a manifestation. That's what we want to try to do. So we want to try to show, hey, what's going on functionally with this person. I'll tell you a quick story actually about that.
Sure.
Really interesting work. So as my world started to collide, I was doing all this sort of biological work on autism and research and biomarkers and so forth. But I was also doing brain scans over here on the, I don't want to say on the side, but it was sort of peripherally related to what I was doing. And we had a woman come in out of town, did this sort of elaborate workup, and we did a brain scan on her. And I said, "What's going on with this woman? Brain scan looks normal. What's up?" And they said, "Oh, no. This woman's struggling immensely. She's got schizophrenia. She's hospitalized, struggling." I said, "Well, I don't see that in the brain scan." And so we went back to the team. We had our meeting. They talked to her. I said, "Do we need to look somewhere else?" And so we did. We looked at her immune system and found these sort of brain antibodies that were, her brain was sort of attacking itself. Okay. And when we treated those, the lady's life completely transformed. Okay. She went from schizophrenic, dysfunctional, hospitalized, highly medicated, to married, has children, totally normal life now. Okay. But my point of that is that, if we look at genetic data or we look at these static markers, it doesn't necessarily tell us functionally what's going on with the brain. And in this individual, the brain scan looked largely unremarkable, which told us that there must be something else going on. So the point is that even in the absence of data, or I'm sorry, in the absence of aberrant findings, of abnormal findings, we still can create a treatment plan or a path to help individuals that doesn't revolve around, trial and error and guesswork. So it's really been an interesting journey to see how these things play out, not only in, these deviant sort of patterns, we'll call them, but also, just purely in the absence of findings. So that was an interesting one that sticks out.
Yeah. Now I want to go back a little bit to the AI part, and
Sure.
of course not from the technical perspective, but on a high
Mhm.
level. Um, and actually, it's good because currently I'm reading, a book about not technical. It's like more philosophical book about
Mhm.
AI. It's called The Nexus by
Mhm.
Harari. He's behind the Sapiens and many great books also as well, and he comes to the part which is talks about the explainability, right? So AI systems are black boxes, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes we don't know why they decide to do something, right? And we don't know even the bias that based on the data that they were trained on. So how we can balance, the algorithms recommendations, I would say, with clinical judgment here to make sure that yes, we know that the traditional way is not giving us the full picture, or sometimes it's even misguiding us. We agree on this. But how we make sure, like, also when we rely on the data and the algorithms, we can still justify it from clinical perspective.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think that what we want to be mindful of and clear about is that we're not trying to create a tool to replace the provider. Okay. What we're trying to do is add a level of objective data to a provider's clinical judgment, which is essential. Okay. Actually, I mean, in full disclosure, when I first started, I thought that we might be able to do that. We might be able to make um, make a system that could fill some of the gaps where care isn't being delivered, under served populations and rural areas and so forth. But what we've really learned over the years is that it definitely requires a human in the loop sort of scenario where we can take into account history and cultural differences and things like that. Okay. So back to your question, kind of on a technical level, what we're trying to do is look at the bigger picture of brain patterns on a data side, almost like a data scientist in your pocket, okay, to say, hey, I have a theory, okay, and this is how it actually came about with our theory of suicidality. All these groups were publishing papers on suicide. It's a very niche group in EEG, okay, in brain scans like we do. They were doing single biomarkers, okay, single biomarkers. This biomarker is associated with suicidality in this population and this biomarker. And so different groups had different biomarkers. And, from my perspective, as a clinician at the time, it was like, there's no way. Suicidality is way too complicated to be narrowed down and boiled down to just one biomarker. Okay. And we had different theories of like maybe 4 or 5 different biomarkers. Okay. And so we bring a human data scientist into our program. And we say, hey, look at our data and tell us what you see. And so the idea was to come in there and see which of the biomarkers seem to hold water in our bigger pool, of data. So I think ultimately from the AI, what we're trying to do is not necessarily create new, necessarily anything that would, replace the clinician or tell them what to do necessarily, but to actually pull different pockets of data together. So for example, one of the things that I'm most interested in is predicting how people respond to treatment, particularly novel treatments. Like here, there's a lot of talk about psychedelics now and neuromodulation techniques where we stimulate the brain and do different types of things like that. I want to know, and I think our patients want to know, and definitely our providers do, who's going to respond to that treatment before you even start? Like that's the question I want to answer. So not necessarily pulling some new novel thing out of the air, although that's great. I want to be able to say, hey, there was 1,000 people before you who did that treatment and they all did well. What do they have in common? Okay. And do you have that marker? Okay. So those are the questions we're trying to answer. So basically, pulling our data, understanding, what people have taken, what have they tried, what hasn't worked, and then also pulling the data of all these brilliant people who are publishing research every day into the system so we can start to see, hey, do these biomarkers hold water in our system as well? Okay. They see this biomarker in their cohort. Do we see that in ours? Okay. So that's really what we're trying to do is to really take all the evidence that's been out there and then compile it with the evidence that we have and put it together and say, here, provider, Mr. Mrs. Provider, here's a guide that may help you to understand what to do, with this patient that's sitting in front of you. So,
Right. How people are, because there is a lot of discussion about these, new trials,
mhm.
because people still, when they hear the name, you know, their mind might go somewhere else, right? And um, so, are you seeing like kind of pushback on adopting these psychedelics, mainly in
oh,
treatments?
oh, psychedelics, you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. It's funny. I was a lot of the pushback. Um, I mean, I see the issue, at the core of it is that I really am uncomfortable with indiscriminate use of treatments. So something new and novel comes out, we're going to do it with everybody, and we learn that so it was so ingrained to us working in autism. Okay. When you see, there's this common sort of saying in autism, if you've seen one autistic kid, you've seen one autistic kid, like that's it. And it's like, when you understand that at your core, that like every kid that comes in with autism, or, now most of them are adults because this is 25 years ago, but they when you see one, they're vastly different, and what helped that kid is likely not going to help the other kid, even if it's their sibling. I remember a case, we had 2 autistic kids. We did the exact same treatment with them at home, and one of the kids did profoundly well. The other kid had no response at all. And I mean, they're siblings doing the exact same treatment at home. You think at least they would, maybe a little bit and a little bit more, but it was like no response at all. And then another kid doing profoundly well. And so when you understand that at your core, that like the label just tells you the cluster of symptoms, but it doesn't tell you what's going on, kind of under the hood. It's basically a check engine light, but it doesn't tell you what's going on under the hood. So to your question, sorry, pushback. on the psychedelics.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I had a lot of reservation because it was being used so just willy nilly. I mean, it was like everyone who had, I mean, the criteria was treatment resistant depression. People could get ketamine. Ketamine isn't a classic psychedelic by the definition, but it's categorized that way. Um,
yeah,
and so everyone was getting ketamine. And I'm like, well, the definition is that you've if two treatments have failed you, two first line psychiatric treatments, medicines. And it's like, well, if you look at this through the brain scan, I just told you 49 or 4,000 different combinations. That's easy. I could make someone fail two treatments like a piece of cake, you know? And so, and then you go do ketamine. So I had a lot of pushback to that myself. But when you start to see, oh, here's a group of people that respond really well, let's put them in a group and do that treatment, your outcomes are remarkably better. And so that's what we're trying to look for. So I think that as far as psychedelic treatments go, I think we're going to continue to see resistance within some of the conventional field if we continue to use it like we continue to use our current psychiatric medications. But psychedelics have done one thing that's been great, I think, for what I do, is that it's created interest outside of medicine to be able to see
yeah.
what's happening in the brain. What's happening to my brain when I take this thing, or which thing should I do? Should I go to the jungle and do ayahuasca, or should I go do
Yes,
ketamine here or whatever? And it's like, oh, I saw, Aaron Rodgers do, psilocybin on Netflix or like whatever it is, you know what I'm saying? And so people see these things and they're like, I think, well, I should do that. I have PTSD. I should go do DMT. But so what it's done is it's taken people from these other fields, particularly people who are interested in tech like us, and people who are maybe have resources, or a team of people with resources to start to answer these questions of like, hey, we want to know what's happening in the brain. But the real question I think we should get to is, I want to know who's going to respond before they do the treatment. Because if you're on your last leg, you're a war veteran, you're someone who's experienced deep grief or trauma, and this is your last hope, and you're going to go spend 6K to go do, psychedelics in the jungle, and if it doesn't work, you're done. I
yes.
want to know who that is before they do that. I want to know who that is, at least with some level of objectivity, not just, I saw it
Eh,
on Netflix.
I think, Steve, this is the beauty of, marrying the experiment with the power of data, and being able to analyze. So I think, work similar to what you've done, and you're still doing, is,
Mhm,
I call it killing the myth, right? So, the myth is will become busted, like, because people, when you need to try, at least you need to test, and without doing that, we'll never move forward. Sorry. And I'm happy, like, because I shared with that you before, like, even personally, right? So even
mhm,
myself, right? So sometimes I did sit and think, okay, do I have ADHD?
mhm,
Do I have this? Do I have that? And then my problem is, it's not my problem, but my expectation is, if I go to someone to see me, they're gonna follow a book, right? I'm not against following books, don't get me
mhm,
wrong, like, I mean, when doing diagnostics, but I mean, this person there, I don't know their current mental status, right?
mhm.
Maybe I came to them today and they were in a very bad mood because maybe they had some issues at home in the morning, or
Yep.
maybe, they had a fight with someone else.
Yes.
So they would be doing this, and they will be asking the questions, and they will be taking notes when I'm talking to them. I've seen it. I went like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, to a mental health clinic. Just, it's just a checkup. It's not like something, I wanted to know about. I did it also with my daughter, by the way, like,
Mhm.
like, because someone told us something, and then, I started to do the research, and then it ended up, what they mentioned is, it didn't match. So, again, and back to the point you just mentioned, like, we need to test, we need to go
Right.
to see where we can go forward. And, mentioning this, tell me more also about the book, like, people, what can expect from the book, other something that we didn't maybe discuss today yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on something that's maybe becoming more and more intuitive to consumers is that, this level of subjectivity is no longer acceptable, especially in an era of the data analysis that we have with AI and these other tools. It just is not, it's not acceptable anymore to do that. And so in any other field in medicine, we test the organ that we're treating. Every other field, okay? Mental health is the only one that doesn't do that. And so, I think the time has come that we need to, adopt some of these tools. I think some of the challenges, and this goes back to what you were asking before, is and maybe one of the even larger challenges that we didn't mention is this sort of fallacy of normalcy. Okay, so like, what is normal? So what are you going to compare me to? How do you judge whether what I'm showing in my scan is normal compared to people who don't have symptoms and so forth? So there's some of the challenges around that, um, and that's been going on for a while, and I have some answers and thoughts, of course, to that. So I think that's a an area that we that that as consumers we're starting to see. I mean, we would never accept that in cardiology. I mean, imagine, for example, you go into cardiology and you say, "Hey, my chest hurts." Okay, and they say,
Hmm.
"Well, tell me about your chest." Well, it kind of hurts. I've been stressed lately, and when I exert myself, I get these chest pains. Okay, well, that could be, you could have a rib out of place. You could have a lung infection. You could have heartburn. You could be having a heart attack. I mean, there's a number of different things that could be all causing that. But they said, you know what? Just go try this thing. Go take this pill. It's a heart medicine, and we'll see how it does. Like, that would never fly, never. And the same with a runny nose. I mean, a runny nose could be 10 different things. You could be crying, you could be sick, you could eat something spicy. But if we just give everybody antihistamines that has a runny nose, and then if antihistamines doesn't work, we do another med, and then we do another med, we do another med. It's like, what are we doing here? I mean, we don't even do that with our cars. It's like, you plug it in, the light's on, you plug it in, you figure out what's going on before you start ripping parts out. So that's what we want to try to do here, with this. So I think ultimately, in your question about the book and the papers, I mean, the papers ultimately are a group of colleagues of mine, um, want to answer this question around, why do people respond so differently to mental health treatments? And so we gathered all the information on lots and lots of studies to show the variability within these common conditions: anxiety, depression, ADHD, trauma, so forth. And trying to give clinicians a guide around bringing brain scans, EEGs, to the table with their clinical evaluations, something they're already used to. Okay, pairing them together. Okay, to show them scientifically there's evidence for that. The book, on the other hand, is more geared towards um, providers, therapists, but also it's geared towards consumers as well, so people understand that, like, hey, my brain isn't necessarily broken. I think the problem is that we just haven't looked under the hood. So we tell some stories about people who have gone through these experiences. We talk about how the field's evolved. We talk about why objective data can make a difference, and it's really a compilation of the last 20 some years of doing this. So I think it's a good entry point for people to start to have that thought and that conversation, whether it's someone who's trying to perform at the highest level of their game, or it's someone with a kid who's struggling or whatever. But you take that book and you go to your provider and say, hey, I want to do I want to do this. I want to figure out how we can do a scan and bring this to our conversation. So ultimately that's where we're at with the work that we're doing.
Um, before I wrap it up, just
Sure.
out of curiosity, when, Steve, we can expect this to be, um, widely used worldwide, and get rid of, the I'm sure, like, the traditional way is not going anyways,
Mhm.
don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
But to have these it's kind of a second opinion. It's
Yeah.
kind of rectifying maybe a wrong treatment, like similar to the example of the girl you just discussed earlier. I gave you, like, my own experience also as well. So what can we do, to change how, and this is in the world of tech. People might ask
Mhm.
while listening, oh, but this is CTO show, like what Steve and Mehmet are discussing is maybe not related directly to tech, but it is related. And people
Yeah.
who follow the show, they know that I had like, you know, people talking about mental health issues for
Yeah.
founders. I had my buddy James Oliver a couple of months ago. He came and
Yeah.
talked about it.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
had like several doctors who came and they shared their experience, and also yourself. So yeah, we talking is good, but how we can make it like more um spread, I would say, like how we can enhance it worldwide. Not,
Right.
I know like you're based in the US, so what are we doing to change this, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, the interest is definitely there. I talked to somebody, from your country just a few months ago, and there's definitely an interest in changing the paradigm. It's a really good question. I mean, I ultimately, I hope in my lifetime it becomes, standard. I think that there's resistance in some ways around, territory and who takes this on. So is it neurologist, is it psychiatrist, or is it a whole new profession that comes on and does this? I mean, ultimately, a provider can't, and I say can't, I mean, they probably could if they tried really hard and studied, but they can't bring this to their practice without having another person in the loop. And so that's the role that we fill to analyze the scans and do this so that the providers don't have to go and learn all this stuff in while seeing patients and in their practice. Um, so yeah, I think larger adoption, validation, third-party payment becomes a big part of the conversation when insurance parties start paying. People tend and doctors tend to start listening a little more. So I think that that can be, a big entry point. But ultimately, I mean, on our front, it comes with funding and support and getting the word out. So it's definitely changing. We're seeing more and more pairing of technology. So like for instance, the TMS world, the magnetic stimulation world is now um, coupling EEG scans before the treatment. So again, it's not a one size fits all. It's more about personalized medicine. So we're seeing a really big push towards personalized medicine with some of these technological based treatments as well, and then monitoring that, seeing how your treatment is responding. So I think there's definitely an interest. It's about being able to bring this at a large level on a platform where people can see it, doctors can experience it. Um, most of our partner clinics, I'll tell you, were first patients. Their kids were patients.
Hmm.
They had a struggling patient, and then they sent him over, and then they experienced that firsthand, and then they became customers of ours. And so I think ultimately it comes down to seeing that. But I think back to maybe when I was in college or something, and not to compare myself to Jobs, but Jobs comes out and he says, "Hey, you guys need this iPod in your pocket to carry, a million songs." And we're like, "That's dumb. Why do I need that? I got a CD player. Like, oh, I don't need that." And so, I think, and a large part of it is that we're delivering something to people that they don't necessarily know that they need, but there's something telling them like, "Hey, we need to change.
Yeah.
We need to change." And so it's about, building the team, getting the word out, getting on these platforms so people can see what's going on. We're not trying to take anybody's jobs. Robots aren't using AI to replace psychiatrists. It's more about just bringing objective data to the table. And really, I mean, ultimately, Matt, is anyone with a brain this applies to. Okay, so whether it's your struggling, neighbor, or whether it's your kid going to school and understanding, should they go to art school? Should they go to music school? Should they go to sports? Like what, engineering? What should they be doing? And if you try to get the wrong brain pattern to fit in the wrong environment, you're going to have friction. And so, man, wouldn't that be cool to do that on every 10-year-old and know like, hey, this is the right environment? Or, maybe we need to, maybe your kid isn't wired for science, but they're wired for music. Let's support them over there. So I think ultimately it comes down to anyone with the brain that we need to be doing these scans routinely.
Yeah, I'm trying to get the name of a book because I like to mention the book um by the head of, it's by the head of the previous head of Google China. Now I will get the name very shortly, and the reason is to your point about jobs and I mean the like replacing jobs and
Yeah,
this
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So I found the book name. It's AI Superpowers by Kai Fu Lee,
Mhm.
and I like the book, and the author mentioned that probably one of the things that gonna stay because AI I I believe in a long time will not be able to do it. The empathy, and
Yeah,
especially when it
mm,
comes to be working in the field of psychology, I think
yeah.
empathy is much
It's
needed. So
huge.
yeah, but yeah, you need a something that help you to do better diagnostics, and this is the whole topic maybe we discussed today. And just if you allow me also, Steve, to add something regarding
Please.
why this is important. Um, of course, like it's not new. It's been with us for a long time. The pressures of the life, and the way how if my grandfather comes alive now and see, I'm sure his mind will get blown, and maybe he will get a second heart attack, whatever, because how can you digest all this information? So just when I sit down and I think only and only about the amount of information I have to deal with daily,
Yeah.
whether emails, messages, and forget work. By the way, I'm talking about normal life. Like still, I
Mhm,
didn't, I didn't do anything related maybe to work. I didn't have to put my brain on something, and it's massive. Plus the messaging we get, and this continuous um, FOMO effect that we are exposed to,
mhm,
and you feel like you are always into this race. So
mhm.
like this is why we need to spread the word about it. And I'm very happy that today you shared with us what you've been up to, Steve, and I think we
Yeah.
need to talk more about it. And I'm happy about the efforts that you're working on, and in everywhere in the world. So that's really encouraging, and I encourage everyone to take it easy. Yeah, I know, like, there's a lot of push outside about AI replacing jobs and
Mhm.
this and that. Take it easy, guys. Like, I know it's not easy, don't get me wrong. My job one day might be being replaced, I'm not sure, but I mean, be assured that you know support, and human support, human empathy is going to be staying. And I think Steve, what you're doing is in the heart of this, because you need to show a lot of empathy to understand also your patient. And again, this is something really, really I appreciate that you took the time today to share with us. Before we close, something I always ask my guests: where people can get in touch and find out more.
Yeah, so definitely most active on LinkedIn. So you can find me there and all of our work and, spreading the word and conversing and so forth. The other area is thinklikeabrain.com. That's my new book. That's probably a good, entry point to grab that and check out what we're up to. And our company is AxonEG Solutions, so you can find our information there, our peer reviewed papers, anything we're working on, and get in touch with us through that website too.
Great. I'll make sure that all the links will be available in the show notes. And again, I can't thank you enough, Steve, for the
Oh,
time and all this information you shared with us. Also, uh, not only the information, I think this enlightenments that you shared with me personally and with my audience. So thank you very much for your time. And this is how I close my episodes as usual. If you just discovered this podcast by luck, thank you for passing by. I hope you enjoyed. If you did so, give me a favor, share it with your friends and colleagues, share it with as many people as you can, because as you see, today topic is very, very important. It's a tech podcast, yes, but we try also to cover all the aspects of the tech and mental health, anything related to psychology of founders, of tech executives, is very important.
mhm.
So share it with as much people as you can. And if you are one of the people who keep coming again and again, thank you for passing. Thank you for keep listening. I appreciate your support, your feedback, and I appreciate also you take the podcast always to new levels. So we see the podcast trending in some countries recently, which we didn't been lucky enough to be there. yet. So thank you again for the support. And as I say, always stay tuned for a new episode very soon. Thank you. Bye bye.